Hello everyone, tonight we're diving into the strange, beautiful mess humans made when they decided that certain things were too sacred, too filthy, or too confusing to touch. From men forced to crawl past their kings because even a royal shadow could kill them, to women exiled to moonlit huts for being temporarily too divine, to the priests who made a career out of washing everyone's invisible sins with buckets of cold water. Ancient life was one long game of don't touch that. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy wandering through the weird corners of human history with me. And while you're here, tell me in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you, because somewhere out there, it's always taboo o'clock. Now, turn off the bright lights, let the room settle into that quiet glow. Maybe pour a bit of tea or something stronger, and let's drift back to a time when purity, fear, and power ruled the world like three very anxious gods. It's funny, isn't it, how every civilization seems to have been founded not on courage or invention, but on fear. The fear of touching the wrong thing, eating the wrong meat, or even standing in the wrong patch of sunlight. Before humans built cities or wrote poetry, they were already experts in drawing invisible lines across the world and calling them sacred. You could pick berries on this side of the hill, but on that side, oh no. That's where the gods apparently vacationed, and they were not fond of visitors. The entire concept of civilization was built like that. A giant do not enter sign painted in ritual blood and good intentions. The word itself, taboo, came later from the Polynesian tapu, meaning both holy and untouchable, which is really just a poetic way of saying, don't mess with it unless you want cosmic food poisoning. Captain Cook learned that the hard way in 1777 when he sailed into Tonga, misunderstood the whole concept, and somehow ended up dead a few months later in Hawaii. Taboos weren't superstitions. They were early traffic laws for the soul. Break one, and it wasn't just bad manners, it was spiritual terrorism. Anthropologists have been trying to decode this logic for over a century, armed with notebooks and mosquito nets, scribbling observations about why people refused to eat certain birds or avoided the left side of a fire. What they found was that the forbidden wasn't random at all. It was language, a moral grammar, pure and impure, inside and outside, alive and sort of but not quite alive. These opposites structured early societies the same way syntax structures a sentence. Violate it, and the meaning, or the person collapses. And so the sacred was born not from awe, but from sanitation. Blood, birth, death, sex, food. All the messy evidence that humans were still made of flesh became surrounded by ritual fences. The irony, of course, is that the same acts that created life were also considered polluting. It's almost as if the ancients were saying, yes, we need reproduction to survive, but let's all agree to pretend it's disgusting. Early religion, in that sense, was one long hygiene campaign disguised as theology. But fear had its uses. If you wanted to control a tribe without building prisons, all you had to do was convince them that breaking invisible rules would make their hair fall out or their crops rot. Fear maintained order better than any chief could. You didn't need guards when everyone believed their shadow could kill them. In ancient Polynesia, even a chief's footprints were taboo. Commoners had to crawl backward in his presence, lest their gaze contaminate his holiness. Power, quite literally, was keeping other people terrified of touching you. The strange beauty of it all is that these invisible boundaries made humans feel safe, even when they made life impossible. They transformed chaos into choreography. You couldn't eat a pig, but you knew why. You couldn't say a dead man's name, but it gave you time to mourn. Every culture wrote its own dictionary of danger, and every one of them swore it came from the gods, not the elders with suspiciously controlling tendencies. Still, there's something mesmerizing about the logic beneath it. This global obsession with purity, with separating clean from unclean, right from wrong, human from divine. It's the kind of reasoning that leads people to wash ritual cups 300 times while drinking water straight from a river full of crocodiles. And somewhere in all that washing and worrying, the first great human emotion took form. Not love, not envy, but sacred fear. Fear has always been humanity's most loyal companion, older than writing, older than language, older even than hope. Before gods had names or temples had walls, there was already the sound of a rustling bush and the immediate conviction that something unseen wanted you dead. That was theology's first draft. The divine didn't descend from the heavens. It crawled out of the dark and made people whisper. Archaeologists find the bones, anthropologists write the theories, but what they're really describing is terror with good public relations. In early societies, from the highlands of New Guinea to the dry plains of Africa, fear wasn't irrational. It was infrastructure. Spirits didn't just haunt, they audited. Step on the wrong patch of earth, and you might offend a ghost with territorial issues. Forget to leave a piece of meat by the fire, and the ancestors might rearrange your luck for the next 5 generations. The invisible world had rules, and breaking them wasn't brave, it was stupid. Mary Douglas, one of the few people who made fear sound elegant, once wrote that dirt is matter out of place. It's a beautiful way of saying everything disgusting is only disgusting because it wandered where it shouldn't. Blood inside the body, holy, blood outside, emergency purification required. Fear wasn't about the unknown, it was about misplaced things. A frog in a temple, a corpse near the well, a woman giving birth too close to the sacred hearth. The human mind couldn't tolerate disorder, so it renamed it impurity and started inventing ceremonies to fix it. In Melanesia, manna, a kind of invisible electricity of power, could bless or kill depending on context. A coconut touched by a chief might make you rich. The same coconut touched by a menstruating woman might erase you from existence. Polynesian taboo, African Orisha taboos, Amazonian restrictions, all were variations on the same logic. Fear was a social contract with invisible signatures. Break it, and the penalty wasn't a fine, it was cosmic decay. The Dogon of Mali, for instance, feared disruption of the cosmic order so much that even their settlements mirrored the human body, head, arms, torso. To walk through a Dogon village was to stroll inside a diagram of the universe. One misplaced doorway could, symbolically speaking, give the cosmos indigestion. Fear kept architecture tidy. Among the Inuit, hunting taboos kept the world balanced. Never mix land and sea meat in the same meal. Never mock an animal you've killed. The line between nourishment and sacrilege was one badly timed joke. It's easy to laugh now, sitting behind screens, happily breaking 10 taboos before breakfast. But those old rules carried a certain wisdom. Fear wasn't always oppression, it was information. It reminded people that power, spiritual or ecological, always demanded caution. The early world was alive, moody, and easily offended, and humans, fragile and curious, survived by pretending to understand its etiquette. So they whispered, bowed, avoided certain foods, and watched the sky for omens. And in that trembling obedience, civilization took its first breath, not in confidence, but in terror disguised as reverence. Because before purity had rituals and temples had walls, there was always blood, shimmering, forbidden, and full of power. There are 2 things humans have always agreed on: that blood keeps you alive, and that it's absolutely horrifying once it leaves the body. The moment it spills, everyone suddenly remembers how fragile the boundary between divine and corpse really is. Across every continent, blood became the world's most sacred paradox, the ultimate proof of life, and the ultimate proof that something's gone terribly wrong. You see it everywhere. Among the Dogon of Mali, menstruating women were kept in special huts, not because they were hated, but because their bodies were considered too cosmically charged to be near daily life. The hut itself wasn't shameful, it was a lightning rod for divine power. In the Arctic, Inuit women avoided men's tools during their cycles, for the same reason, not impurity, exactly, but excess potency. Blood, to the ancient mind, wasn't filth, it was nuclear material, and no one wanted to stand too close. The Hebrews institutionalized that logic in Leviticus. Touch blood, touch death, touch childbirth, and you need purification, because holiness and human fluids don't mix. In Hinduism, similar purity codes divided space, diet, and caste around who could approach the sacred fire, and when. To the priests, cleanliness wasn't metaphorical, it was thermodynamic. The gods couldn't dwell in a contaminated environment any more than fish could breathe smoke. But blood's danger wasn't limited to women. Warriors, too, had to be purified after battle. The Maasai washed with milk and herbs before re-entering village life. Aztec priests bathed obsessively after sacrifices, as if the gods might file complaints if they didn't. Everywhere, the red stuff demanded ceremony. The logic was simple. blood belonged inside, and when it wasn't, someone human or divine needed to apologize. What's unsettling is how universal the anxiety became. From the Yanomami in the Amazon to the Shinto shrines of Japan, purity rituals grew around any sign of bleeding, birth, or decay. Anthropologists call it pollution theory. The people living it just called it Tuesday. In Japan, women in childbirth were separated not for moral reasons, but because birth was seen as a temporary collision between worlds, the living and the ancestral, and that kind of metaphysical traffic jam required supervision. Even today, we can't quite shake it. We wrap blood in sterile gloves, hide menstruation in euphemisms, and still whisper about dirty things, as if microbes were moral agents. Ancient taboos never really died. They just rebranded as hygiene. And maybe that's the secret. We never stopped fearing contamination. We just replaced gods with bacteria. What ancient people understood, in their own poetic way, was that purity wasn't about moral superiority, it was about survival. Blood reminded everyone that flesh was temporary, and that whatever lived inside it, spirit, soul, consciousness, electricity, could leak out at any moment. The sacred, after all, was only ever one bad cut away from becoming medical waste. And once you've built a world on that logic, where every drop of fluid needs divine permission, the next step is inevitable. Start worrying about what goes into the body as much as what comes out. Nothing reveals a civilization's neuroses quite like its menu. The things people refuse to eat tell you far more than what they actually put on the plate. For ancient societies, food wasn't just sustenance, it was theology you could chew. Every bite was a moral act, a potential crime, or, in particularly dramatic cases, an invitation for divine retribution. Take pork. Poor pigs, too intelligent for comfort, too fond of filth to be trusted. Ancient Hebrews, later joined by Muslims, saw the animal as a living symbol of disorder. In hot climates without refrigeration, pork spoiled quickly, and spoiled meat killed people. So religion stepped in with a sharper warning label: unclean. The logic worked. No one argued with God over food safety. Centuries later, the rule still stands, though the reasons have fermented into theology. What began as public health became identity. Across the subcontinent, Hindu reverence for cows flipped the same anxiety inside out. Where others saw dinner, India saw divinity. Cows gave milk, fuel, and labor. To kill them was to sever the artery of civilization. It's an almost perfect mirror of the pork taboo. What's sacred in one place is scandalous in another, and the gods, it seems, have very local taste buds. Then, there were the totemic diets clans across Aboriginal Australia or the Pacific Islands who refused to eat their totem animals. If your lineage was linked to the sea turtle, the turtle became off limits. Not because of cuteness, but because it was kin. Killing it was cannibalism of a cosmic sort. And so ecology was folded into ancestry. You were what you didn't eat. In Arctic cultures, the rules were equally strict, but colder and weirder. Among the Inuit, mixing land and sea animals in a single meal was a cosmic no-no. A seal and a caribou couldn't share a bowl. It blurred the boundaries between realms. The world, in their view, had layers: sky, ice, earth, and confusing them was how you got storms, famine, or worse, annoyed shamans. Imagine explaining that at dinner. Sorry, I can't have surf and turf. It offends the metaphysical plumbing. And then there's the Amazon, where hunters avoided eating animals that resembled themselves, monkeys, sloths, anything vaguely human-shaped, because consuming them risked inviting their souls in. Even among cannibal tribes, eating people required strict ritual justification. You couldn't just snack on a neighbor. It had to mean something cosmological. What's striking is that every one of these food taboos, from kosher to caste-based, from Arctic to equatorial, revolves around the same obsession: keeping the world neatly categorized. Sky creatures, land creatures, water creatures, everyone in their proper metaphysical drawer. Eating the wrong thing wasn't disgusting. It was insubordination. The universe was a pantry, and someone had labeled everything forbidden, sacred, or modern nutritionists call it diet. Ancient people called it destiny. The line between survival and sacrilege was drawn with a knife. And when you live in a world where every meal might offend the gods, you begin to realize that death itself, the ultimate decay, must be even more complicated. Death, to ancient people, wasn't an ending, it was a leak, a dangerous one. A body that stopped breathing didn't simply go bad. It started broadcasting contamination like an untuned radio. The soul might have wandered off, but the flesh kept whispering decay into the world. No wonder nearly every culture on Earth treated corpses as spiritual biohazards wrapped in ceremony. In ancient Egypt, the dead were mummified with the same care modern labs reserve for toxic waste. Every organ had a guardian god, every incision a chant to keep the infection from spreading, not just the biological kind, but the cosmic one. Touching the dead required purification because, in a world where divinity meant order, decomposition was the ultimate blasphemy. The flesh that once served Ma'at, the sacred balance, now invited Isfit, chaos. The ancient Hebrews institutionalized this same dread. The Book of Numbers prescribes 7 days of purification for anyone who so much as brushed a corpse. Holy people didn't handle bodies, they supervised from a safe, sanitized distance. And just in case you were tempted to argue, there was always the threat that touching death might make your prayers bounce off the ceiling. It's remarkable, really. One of humanity's earliest public health codes, disguised as divine etiquette. In India, Brahmin priests developed entire manuals for avoiding corpse pollution. Funerals were spiritual quarantine zones. Anyone who touched the dead, the pyre, or even the ashes was required to bathe, change clothes and stay away from temples for a time. The concept of walker purity wasn't about soap. It was about resetting cosmic hygiene. A contaminated priest risked confusing the gods, and nobody wanted to explain to Vishnu why the offerings smelled like cremation smoke. Africa preserved similar logic in more localized form. Among the Shona of Zimbabwe, death polluted not only the body but also the homestead. Houses where people died were abandoned for weeks, sometimes burned outright. In Madagascar, families practiced famidahana, the turning of the bones, reopening tombs to rewrap ancestors in fresh cloth. It sounds macabre, but the ritual renewed both memory and purity. The dead, if neglected, grew restless. If tended, they became harmless. Even the Greeks, supposedly rational, were terrified of miasma, the spiritual smog that emanated from death, childbirth, and murder alike. Oedipus didn't just bring scandal to Thebes, he brought literal pollution. The land withered because a corpse crime had gone unconfessed. The plague was narrative, moral, and microbial all at once. Inuit taboos in the Arctic added another layer of complexity. After death, relatives followed strict isolation. No hunting, no sowing, no loud noise lest the soul get confused and linger. Death required a period of cosmic silence, as if the entire village held its breath until the border between life and afterlife closed again. To die, in those worlds, was not private. It was a civic disturbance. Death contaminated space, tools, and sometimes language itself. In Aboriginal Australia, the deceased's name was never spoken again, a linguistic quarantine to keep spirits from being accidentally summoned like metaphysical telemarketers. The point wasn't cruelty, it was respect through distance. Death reminded everyone that flesh was unreliable, that the human body could switch allegiance from sacred to dangerous overnight. So the living washed, waited, renamed, rebuilt, anything to re-establish the fragile line between order and rot. And in doing so, they stumbled on a strange truth. If even death could pollute, then life itself needed constant supervision. Which brings us to the next great anxiety, what people did with that other ungovernable force, desire. It's hard to think of anything that terrified ancient societies more than sex, except maybe admitting that everyone was already doing it. Desire was treated like divine electricity, essential for the continuation of life, yet far too unstable to be left unsupervised. So entire civilizations built elaborate fences around it, wrapped it in ceremony, and then pretended to be shocked when anyone tried to climb over. Incest taboos are the most famous of these fences, so universal that anthropologists still argue about who built them first. Claude Lévi-Strauss, in one of his more poetic moments, claimed they were humanity's way of saying, "Let's trade wives instead of killing each other." A practical suggestion, really. By forbidding family unions, tribes forced alliances, creating networks of kinship that doubled as insurance policies. It was less about genetics, which they couldn't have known, and more about politics. Every marriage was a treaty, every taboo, a peace accord signed in bed. But sex wasn't only forbidden within families. It was often outlawed before rituals, hunts, or battles. The Amazonian Tucano would abstain for weeks before major ceremonies. Polynesian navigators refused intimacy before voyages, and the ancient Celts considered pre-war chastity a tactical move, as if pent-up libido could somehow sharpen a spear. The logic was cosmic conservation. Don't waste life force before you need it. The body was a battery. An orgasm was a power outage. Of course, some took it further. In parts of Melanesia, initiation rituals for boys included strict sexual seclusion and symbolic purification to remove maternal influence, a metaphysical divorce from the contaminating softness of women. In a few societies, bodily fluids were believed to transmit spiritual essence itself. So sex wasn't intimacy, it was alchemy. That's why it required ritual. You weren't just sharing affection, you were swapping cosmic assets. Religions eventually institutionalized these anxieties. The Greeks admired fertility gods, but distrusted actual fertility. Hinduism turned desire, into a divine principle, but still warned against indulgence. And medieval Christianity, when it arrived much later, simply perfected the art of pretending pleasure was a theological error. But centuries earlier, the pattern was already set. Pleasure had to be useful, timed, and preferably supervised by someone wearing beads or holding incense. The irony, of course, is that sexuality and sanctity have always been neighbors. The same temples that condemned lust were often covered in erotic carvings. The same rituals that demanded abstinence often ended in symbolic unions of gods and goddesses. It was as if humanity couldn't decide whether sex was the engine of creation or its annual maintenance hazard. Yet beneath the taboos, the fear was consistent. Sex blurred lines between families, between genders, between sacred and profane. Every society that tried to control it was really trying to control confusion. And confusion, as we've already seen, was just another word for impurity. So they segregated, purified, performed, anything to keep love from destabilizing the cosmos. But desire, like water, always finds cracks. And when societies couldn't silence it, they turned to something even more delicate to control: language itself. The easiest way to recognize a sacred society is to notice what no one dares to say out loud. Silence, in ancient life, was never just awkward, it was protective. Words were treated like loaded weapons. Each syllable could wound, summon, or accidentally invite the wrong spirit to dinner. Language, after all, was considered a kind of magic, and no sensible person waved magic around carelessly. In many indigenous Australian groups, when someone died, their name died with them. Uttering it was thought to recall their spirit, which might take offense at being dragged back from the afterlife just to listen to gossip. So for months, sometimes years, communities avoided not just the deceased's name, but any word that sounded remotely similar. Entire vocabularies had to be replaced temporarily. Linguists, with their dry enthusiasm, called this lexical replacement. The locals just called it respect, and possibly good ghost management. The Inuit followed similar customs. When a person passed away, their name entered a period of quarantine, as if it too might be contagious. Speaking it risked confusing the wandering soul, luring it back toward the living. The logic was consistent. A soul was a bit like a migrating bird. It needed clear skies, not people shouting its name from the shoreline. In Polynesia, the rule expanded beyond death. Chiefs were so sacred that even their names, and sometimes the words that contained their syllables, became taboo. If a chief was named Tui, suddenly tuna became off-limit. The language bent itself around power, and people learned to tiptoe verbally through their own vocabulary. Imagine every promotion at court triggering a mandatory linguistic update. Grammar, but make it political. China developed an imperial version of the same principle. During the Tang dynasty, using the emperor's given name, even accidentally, was a punishable offense. Scribes sometimes rewrote entire scrolls to avoid it, replacing characters as delicately as a surgeon removing tumors. It wasn't reverence, it was risk management. When the ruler's name became unspeakable, so did disobedience. What tied all these taboos together was a shared superstition disguised as etiquette. Words could trespass. To speak something out of place was to let it escape the safe zone of thought and start haunting the air. In some African traditions, personal names were secret. Only family or ritual elders could utter them. Outsiders used praise names instead, metaphors that concealed the real identity beneath layers of poetry. Language became armor. It's not that people were stupid, they were careful. The ancients understood that sound had power, a lesson every propagandist, politician, and pop star still exploits. Naming created bonds. It defined reality. So when the name of a god, a chief, or a corpse became forbidden, it wasn't censorship, it was containment. The word itself was radioactive, and once a society starts fearing syllables, it inevitably starts reorganizing space. If a name can pollute a mouth, then surely a body can pollute a place. The world, after all, needed clean rooms as much as clean sentences. Every culture eventually discovers that fear has geometry. The earth, in ancient eyes, wasn't a smooth playground. It was a map of spiritual pressure zones. Certain corners hummed with power, others reeked of danger. And the most terrifying of all were the thresholds, the in-between places where purity and pollution met for coffee. The logic was simple. If people could contaminate each other, then places could too. In West Africa, the Yoruba built shrines at crossroads because that's where energies collided, divine, human, and occasionally drunk. The crossroads was never neutral ground. You left offerings there, but you didn't linger unless you wanted your luck scrambled. Across the world, the Japanese invented torii gates for similar reasons, a visual border between ordinary space and sacred territory. Step through without bowing, and you didn't just break protocol. You risked confusing the gods about where you belonged. The architecture itself whispered, "Clean yourself up before you enter eternity." Among the Dogon of Mole, the entire village was a diagram of the human body, head, arms, spine, a living anatomy lesson in mud and thatch. The idea was cosmic hygiene. Every function of society had its proper location. The blacksmith, who worked with fire and death, stayed at the village's edge, far from the granaries of fertility. A misplaced forge could throw the cosmos off balance, like building a crematorium inside a nursery. Ancient temples everywhere followed the same choreography of cleanliness. Egyptians aligned theirs with the rising sun. The builders of Angkor Wat faced west toward Vishnu's underworld aspect. Even Neolithic stone circles in Britain seem obsessed with solstices, as if the landscape itself required calibration. Every direction carried a metaphysical voltage. North was wisdom, south was fertility, east was renewal, west was the bureaucratic wing of the afterlife. A badly oriented altar wasn't just poor design, it was spiritual vandalism. In India, the practice of Vastu Shastra codified this logic into an early form of architectural feng shui. Bedrooms, kitchens, shrines, each assigned a compass direction according to its spiritual temperature. Sleep near the wrong corner and you might wake up cursed, or at least badly rested. The home wasn't property. It was a miniature universe that needed to be kept in cosmic alignment, like a household solar system running on incense and paranoia. And because purity was fragile, barriers multiplied. The Maori carved waharo gateways to mark sacred land. Medieval Europeans built church lychgates to separate cemetery from street. Even today, we instinctively pause at doorways, take off shoes, or whisper in temples, not superstition, just muscle memory from millennia of boundary management. The irony is that the cleanest places were often the most dangerous. Step into a temple uninvited, and your impurities could set the walls buzzing with offense. Sacred space didn't comfort, it judged. To exist in balance with it, people invented endless rituals of entry, washing, bowing, facing the right way, spatial diplomacy between flesh and divinity. Because once the ground itself could be defiled, touch became political. Space had rules, but so did proximity. The next taboo drew its lines, not on the earth, but on skin. Touch, for ancient societies, was never just physical contact, it was a kind of moral contagion. To brush against the wrong person, shadow, or sacred object could rearrange your place in the universe faster than any crime. The human body, they believed, was a vessel of energies leaking in all directions, and boundaries had to be policed with priestly precision. Modern people worry about personal space. The ancients worried about cosmic infection. In Polynesia, for instance, the bodies of chiefs were so charged with mana, a sort of divine electricity, that any accidental touch from a commoner could kill, literally kill, or at least earn a creative execution. Even their shadows were off limits. Walking beneath one was like stepping under a lightning cable. The same principle extended to their belongings. A chief's comb, mat, or cup was as radioactive as his person. It wasn't pride, it was physics. Sacredness, they believed, wasn't a personality trait, it was a measurable voltage. Ancient Hawaiians took this further. Commoners couldn't let their heads rise higher than the chiefs, and during royal processions, people had to lie flat on their stomachs until the divine convoy passed. The body became a topographical map of hierarchy. Your height determined your purity level. Social distance wasn't metaphorical, it was a survival tactic. India, of course, codified this idea with terrifying thoroughness. The caste system wasn't just about class, it was a theology of touch. Certain groups were considered achuta, untouchable, because contact with them could spiritually contaminate higher castes. A Brahmin brushed by a sweeper might as well have rolled in a metaphysical mud puddle. The polluted weren't dirty in any practical sense. They simply embodied the parts of society everyone depended on but didn't want to admit existed: death, waste, blood. It was an elegant, cruel system that turned purity into segregation and sanctity into social control. Other places found subtler versions. The Maasai avoided touching a warrior's spear without permission. In Japan, Shinto priests purified their hands before approaching a shrine, as if rinsing off spiritual fingerprints. Even greetings were designed to avoid unnecessary physical exchange. The bow, the nod, the clasped hands, all inventions for keeping reverence at arm's length. What unites these rituals is the same anxious poetry that runs through every taboo, the belief that proximity is power. To touch someone was to acknowledge shared essence, and not everyone deserved that privilege. The wrong handshake could blur boundaries between classes, castes, genders, or even species. That's why shamans, those professional boundary crossers, were both revered and feared. They touched the sick, the dead, the divine, all the places polite society avoided. They handled pollution so others could stay pure. Touch, in that sense, became a diagnostic tool for civilization itself. The more a society feared contact, the more elaborate its hierarchies became. Power insulated itself in distance. Purity hid behind protocol. And in the end, the people who embodied danger the most were not criminals or sinners, but women, those unpredictable agents of blood, birth, and transformation who had the audacity to remind everyone where life actually came from. For most of human history, women have been accused of causing every cosmic malfunction from eclipses to bad harvests, and somehow, they still had to clean up afterward. It's one of the great ironies of civilization. The same people who kept the species alive were also labeled its primary source of pollution. In nearly every traditional society, purity revolved around women, sometimes reverently, sometimes cruelly, often both at once. Menstrual blood was the main culprit. It terrified men, mystified priests, and inspired an entire library of purification rituals. Among the Dogon of Mali, menstruating women lived in separate huts, away from daily life, for the duration of their cycles. Outsiders often described this as exile, but within the Dogon worldview, it was more complicated. The huts were seen as cosmological reset chambers. The woman wasn't impure. She was overloaded, temporarily radioactive with life. The separation wasn't punishment. It was quarantine from divinity. The same pattern appears worldwide. The Navajo built Canalda ceremonies around first menstruation, seclusion, not shame. In Shinto Japan, shrine maidens were excused from temple duties during their cycles, not because they were lesser, but because their state was considered too spiritually potent for confined space. The body's ability to bleed without dying made women seem halfway between mortal and divine, a status societies could never quite categorize, so they opted for ritual supervision. Childbirth carried similar contradictions. It was sacred enough to require divine aid, and yet polluting enough to demand purification afterward. In Hinduism, new mothers observed strict isolation. The household would only be considered pure again after elaborate cleansing rituals. In Christian Europe, women underwent churching after giving birth, a ceremony that supposedly restored their spiritual cleanliness, though one suspects the real reason was male discomfort with blood and mortality. And yet, in all this choreography of fear, women also became keepers of purity itself. They brewed the cleansing herbs, maintained the household altars, and carried out the daily rituals that kept communities in spiritual working order. Anthropologists note that across Africa and Melanesia, women served as ritual cleaners, sweeping sacred spaces, preparing offerings, managing the transition zones between life and death. The same system that branded them dangerous relied on them to disinfect the cosmos. In some ways, the contradiction is poetic. Every society projected its ambivalence about life onto women's bodies, or disguised as anxiety. Fertility was power, but also proof that life was cyclical, not eternal, and that made men deeply nervous. So taboos multiplied. Don't touch her, don't eat her food, don't enter her hut, don't sit in her chair. Each rule pretending to protect, each one quietly policing. And yet, within those invisible walls, women developed their own kind of ritual authority. They knew when the moon turned, when the blood came, when the birth started, when the crops should be sown. Their knowledge was embodied, not written, which made it harder for men to control. The irony is that every menstrual exile hut, every childbirth impurity rite, also doubled as a sanctuary of memory, places where women kept track of time long before calendars were invented. But maintaining purity, both personal and cosmic, was never a solo job. Every culture eventually invented professionals to handle the heavy lifting, spiritual plumbers for the leaks between the human and the divine. Every culture eventually realized that purity is exhausting work. You can't expect the average farmer, hunter, or traumatized shepherd to remember which direction to face while washing their hands after touching a frog. So, they outsourced the job. Enter the priests, shamans, and ritual cleaners, humanity's earliest customer service representatives for the supernatural. They weren't exactly doctors, and not quite magicians. They were the people who knew how to stop your invisible problems from getting worse. Among the Yoruba priests of Ifa the Babelio acted as spiritual auditors. They managed the economy of impurity through divination, herbs, and negotiation with the gods. If you'd broken a taboo, they'd diagnose the cosmic damage like accountants checking for moral overdrafts. A little sacrifice here, a ritual bath there, voila, balance restored. The system ran less on faith than on bureaucracy. Purity was paperwork. In Japan, the Kunushi and Miko of Shinto shrines specialized in purification through water, salt, and ritual choreography. The practice of misagi, washing in cold streams or under waterfalls, was less about hygiene and more about resetting your metaphysical settings to factory default. The Japanese word for sin, sumi, literally meant pollution. You didn't confess it, you scrubbed it. Imagine Catholicism run by spa attendants. The Amazonian Pays worked with smoke instead. They burned leaves, blew tobacco over patients, and sang healing songs to guide wayward spirits back into place. Anthropologists, ever cautious, call it ritual purification through sound. The tribes just called it not dying of bad luck. Smoke, in almost every culture, was the preferred detergent of the unseen, visible enough to be reassuring, intangible enough to convince spirits it was one of them. And then there were the shamans of Siberia, who handled pollution at its source by leaving the human realm altogether. When illness, drought, or taboo breaking corrupted the community's balance, the shaman went into trance, climbed the invisible world tree, and argued with whoever was in charge. Their job description was essentially part-time god whisperer, full-time existential hazard. It wasn't a career with great life expectancy, but it had benefits, namely, everyone treated you like walking holy disinfectant. Even in places that preferred priests over transers, the logic was the same. Impurity was a technical problem. The priest didn't forgive, he recalibrated. The Aztecs washed sacrificial knives between ceremonies. Brahmins bathed after every ritual. Catholic priests, centuries later, inherited the same obsession with vestments and hat washing. All religions eventually learned that purity sells, and let's be honest, it was good business. The more rules a society had, the more purification it required. Each forbidden act created an entire industry of repentance. Priests became the world's first professionals in risk management. Shamans the earliest therapists. Ritual cleaners the original public health officials. Between them, they kept chaos contained and fear monetized. But once fear gets institutionalized, it doesn't stay in the marketplace of ritual. It seeps upward into law. What began as whispers in the dark corners of tribal huts soon appeared carved in stone, written on scrolls, enforced by kings. At some point, someone realized you didn't need the gods to enforce fear. A good bureaucrat would do just fine. What began as whispers from the spirits eventually turned into bullet points on clay tablets, and the ancient world's first lawmakers essentially plagiarized religion. The gods, they decided, would now be backed by a filing system. Take the Hittites around 1300 BCE. They wrote down rules that made even the gods look lenient. If you accidentally stepped on sacred ground, you didn't get divine forgiveness. You got fined. Killing certain animals required purification rituals and a small mountain of bread as compensation. Every offense, from touching the wrong corpse to sleeping with your sister's maid, came with a tariff. They turned cosmic anxiety into an itemized list. In a sense, they invented the moral tax code. The Hebrews took it further. The Book of Leviticus, still the most ambitious cleanliness manual ever written, transformed spiritual taboos into state policy. It legislated everything from dietary restrictions to bodily emissions. You could almost hear the priestly scribes arguing about what counts as mildew. The result was breathtakingly detailed. Holiness achieved through micromanagement. No other ancient people wrote so lovingly about mold. In India, the Manusmriti codified purity into a caste-based constitution. Your birth determined your ritual worth. Your touch, your meals, your marriage, all preordained by divine precedent. It was cosmic apartheid, disguised as moral order, and it worked precisely because it wrapped social hierarchy in spiritual silk. If a rule came from the gods, who could appeal it? Bureaucracy finally found its theology. The Greeks called their version nomos law, but the roots were the same. Pollution miasma wasn't just a private problem anymore. It was a civic emergency. If someone murdered a relative, or even failed to purify after a funeral, the whole city risked divine retaliation. In Thebes, the gods didn't punish Oedipus for bad parenting. They punished everyone for not cleaning up the metaphysical mess. Collective guilt was born, and with it, the concept of jurisdiction. Even China got in on the act. The Zhou dynasty's Book of Rites, the Li Ji, prescribed correct behavior for every social interaction: eating, mourning, speaking, sneezing near elders. The aim wasn't kindness, it was containment. If everyone performed the right gestures in the right order, the empire would remain stable, like a divine bureaucracy in perfect balance. Everywhere, taboo logic became law because it worked. People obeyed better when you told them disorder offended the cosmos. Fear of chaos made excellent governance. It's difficult to protest taxes when you think the universe might implode if you skip one. In time, the priests and lawmakers fused into a single organism, half prophet, half accountant, turning invisible danger into measurable crime. And as civilization tightened its grip on purity, a strange new freedom appeared at the edges, the right to break rules safely. If everything sacred was forbidden, then transgression itself became a kind of therapy. Sooner or later, people needed a holiday from holiness. For all their obsession with order, ancient societies understood something modern ones often forget. Fear needs a release valve. No one can live under perpetual cosmic supervision without eventually throwing a party. So they invented festivals, gloriously chaotic intervals where everything forbidden became, temporarily, essential. Sin, after all, is only fun when it's scheduled. Take the Dionysian festivals in Greece. For most of the year, the Greeks worshipped moderation, balance, and clean tunics. Then Dionysus came around, and suddenly the entire city went feral. Drunkenness, masks, gender swapping, and a healthy amount of theatrical screaming, all officially sanctioned by the state. It wasn't rebellion, it was maintenance. The Greeks knew that suppressing instinct for too long made societies brittle. A few days of holy madness kept the rest of the year bearable. In the Amazon, the Euripari rituals played the same trick in a more intimidating costume. Men, who usually avoided taboo breaking like it carried smallpox, would don sacred masks representing ancestral spirits. They'd perform transgressive ceremonies, dancing, shouting, sometimes even mocking their own gods. The purpose wasn't blasphemy, it was balance. By crossing lines under controlled conditions, the tribe reminded itself why the lines existed. It was spiritual venting disguised as theater. Africa had its own version of this cosmic reset button. The Dogon performed masked dances during funerary rites, chaotic, noisy, full of mockery, precisely when decorum would otherwise demand silence. The masks represented forces of disorder, invited into the village for one night to remind everyone that even chaos had a job to do. In Central Africa, the Agungan masquerades of the Yoruba served a similar function. Ancestors returned to chastise the living, often by playfully humiliating them in public. Nothing dissolves tension like a dead uncle in a glittering costume telling you you're lazy. Even the medieval Europeans, those champions of repression, had their release valves: carnival, the feast of fools, the occasional saint's day that mysteriously devolved into public intoxication. Peasants dressed as priests, priests dressed as animals, and for 24 delirious hours, society remembered that laughter, too, was a purification ritual. You can only fear authority if you occasionally get to parody it. The anthropologist Victor Turner called these moments liminality, the state of being between categories, where normal rules collapse and transformation becomes possible. But ancient people didn't need the vocabulary. They just knew that without controlled doses of disorder, the social body would suffocate under its own sanctity. Fear was healthy as long as it could laugh at itself once in a while. Ritual transgression also taught empathy. When everyone breaks rules together, even briefly, hierarchy wobbles. A chief dances beside a commoner, a priest makes a fool of himself, and for one luminous evening, the world remembers that purity was always a performance. The morning after, of course, everyone went back to pretending otherwise, washing hands, bowing properly, pretending not to remember what they shouted at midnight. But something shifted. Fear aired out and mocked, lost a little of its edge. The taboo remained, but its authority softened, its shadow less suffocating. And then history, being history, found a way to weaponize even that release. Because when new powers arrived, colonial, missionary, imperial, they didn't just misread taboos, they used them. When Europeans finally stumbled into the rest of the world carrying Bibles, brandy, and an unshakable sense of superiority, they found something that terrified them even more than malaria: other people's logic. Taboos, those invisible threads that kept ancient societies in delicate balance, were suddenly labeled superstition, devil worship, or, if the anthropologist was polite, primitive psychology. It was the perfect colonial setup. Turn someone's sacred code into a pathology, and you don't have to feel guilty for erasing it. Captain Cook, for instance, learned the word tapu from Polynesians and immediately misunderstood it. To him, it meant off-limits. To them, it meant the entire metaphysical architecture of existence. Within decades, tapu had been absorbed into English as taboo, stripped of context, and neatly packaged for Western consumption, a fascinating curiosity. Like a shrunken head you could discuss over tea. Missionaries soon followed, armed with soap and suspicion, eager to purify the heathen by dismantling the very systems that had kept their societies stable for centuries. In Africa, colonial administrators weaponized purity codes to divide communities. Ritual specialists, once mediators between life and death, were branded witches or fetish priests. Traditional healers were outlawed. Christian baptism replaced ancestral cleansing rites. The body, once seen as the meeting point of cosmic forces, became a problem to be civilized. Fear was no longer managed collectively through ritual. It was privatized through guilt. In India, British reformers confronted Hindu taboos with bureaucratic zeal. Cow protection, caste purity, widow rituals, all treated as moral flaws in need of correction. But behind every civilizing act was an opportunistic calculus. By condemning local taboos as backward, the empire positioned itself as the ultimate priest, arbiter of what was pure, rational, and legal. The same trick was repeated across continents. Dismantle indigenous moral systems, then replace them with Western law, which was conveniently immune to blasphemy accusations. And yet, the colonizers didn't actually abolish taboo, they rebranded it. Victorian England was one giant purity cult dressed in lace. Sex was unspeakable. Women were divided into virgins and mistakes, and even the piano legs were covered to prevent indecent thoughts. The West's disgust for native superstition was simply envy disguised as enlightenment. They weren't freeing the world from taboos, they were exporting their own. By the late 19th century, anthropology had turned the forbidden into a spectator sport. Men in linen suits roamed jungles and deserts, cataloguing irrational fears, as if the locals' belief that menstruation could disturb crops was somehow more absurd than Europe's conviction that salvation depended on eating a piece of bread that was also a god. Taboos became evidence of backwardness, the perfect colonial propaganda. They feared their own shadows. We, on the other hand, have railroads, but history, with its usual sense of irony, refused to cooperate. Many of those irrational taboos contained practical wisdom, ecological restraint, disease prevention, psychological catharsis. The rules the colonizers mocked often turned out to be survival mechanisms dressed as religion. Civilization, it seems, has always been a slow learner, and so, after centuries of conquest, ridicule, and forced conversion, taboos didn't vanish. They simply went underground, waiting, because purity, fear, and power are not erasable, they just change costumes. And even today, under fluorescent lights and secular slogans, the ancient logic persists. The sacred didn't die under empire. It adapted, quietly, into our modern habits of censorship, shame, and silence. Which brings us full circle to the lingering truth that the forbidden never really disappears. It just modernizes its vocabulary, trading shrines for headlines, priests for pundits, and curses for outrage. If history has a sense of humor, it's the kind that laughs quietly while humanity repeats itself. Strip away the temples, incense, and oracles, and the same old ghosts are still running the place. Only now they wear lab coats, hold microphones, or moderate online forums. The ancient logic of taboo never left. It just switched fonts. Modern societies like to think they outgrew the forbidden, but look closer. The rituals have changed, not the reflexes. We no longer purify ourselves in rivers before touching the sacred. We sanitize our hands before touching keyboards. We don't exile the menstruating. We just pretend it doesn't exist. We call it privacy now, but the tone is the same. Polite avoidance of the things that remind us we're still made of meat. Social media, meanwhile, has resurrected the purity laws with algorithmic precision. Say the wrong thing, then you're cast out, ritually shamed, your digital name erased like a hieroglyphic damnatio memoria. The gods may have left, but the mob handles their duties beautifully. Ancient people feared offending the divine. Modern people fear the comments section. Either way, the punishment is exile. Psychologically, taboo still performs its oldest trick, making ordinary acts feel dangerous enough to matter. Eating, speaking, touching, desiring. These are the foundations of human life, too mundane for myth. Taboos turn them into theater, giving our appetites moral weight. They teach us that the world is alive and that behavior has consequences. It's a deeply flattering illusion, really, that the universe cares how we chew or who we kiss. But under that illusion lies a kernel of wisdom. Early people weren't irrational, they were cautious. Their fear of pollution was a poetic way of describing feedback, that the world reacts, that balance matters, that every action leaves residue. They didn't have words like ecosystem or psychosomatic stress, so they called it taboo. And they were right. You can't spill blood, dump waste, or speak cruelty without the world noticing. You can only hope your ritual or your apology is convincing enough. Even now, the forbidden shapes the possible. Every culture defines itself by its boundaries, and what it refuses to touch becomes the mirror that shows what it values most. Purity is never about cleanliness, it's about identity. Fear, when managed, is just moral choreography, a way of keeping the tribe in sync. And power, as always, belongs to those who decide what counts as dirt. So yes, we still live by taboos, only they're dressed in secular clothes. They guide etiquette, censorship, health, politics, and desire. We bow to them daily without realizing it, muttering their prayers in the language of wellness, decency, and policy compliance. The altars have Wi-Fi now, but the impulse is ancient, to draw a circle around the unknown and whisper, "Don't touch that." Because even the bravest modern minds still flinch at the same eternal truth that haunted their ancestors, that purity, fear, and power are just different ways of saying one thing: the world is fragile, and so are we. Long before kings carved commandments into stone, rules lived in the air, invisible, fragile, and oddly sticky. People walked carefully, as if brushing against the wrong breath might tangle them in it. Every gesture had a shadow meaning, every meal a hidden clause. You didn't step over a sleeping dog, you didn't whistle at the sun, and you certainly didn't mention the dead at night unless you wanted company. It wasn't superstition yet, it It was survival dressed as choreography. The first societies weren't bound by laws. They were bound by the silent agreement that some things simply must not be done, not because anyone explained why, but because everyone somehow knew. It's easy to mock that now, sitting behind screens and calling it primitive belief. But those whispered prohibitions were the only thing standing between cooperation and chaos. They were the operating system of the human mind before the software of reason was installed. Anthropologists later gave it grand names: taboo, sacred prohibition, the social contract, but to the people living inside it, it felt like something older than words. Imagine a hunter pausing before a carcass, his spear still warm, sensing that he's crossed an invisible line he didn't know existed. The air shifts, the silence thickens, and he just knows he's offended something larger than himself. Not a god yet, not quite, more like the invisible thread holding his world together. Pull it, and the fabric trembles. Some of these rules made sense in retrospect. Don't eat shellfish during hot months unless you enjoy food poisoning. Don't sleep where the dead are buried unless you want to join them. Others were sheer poetry pretending to be policy. Don't look at the moon too long. Don't touch twins. Don't let women see the spear that killed. Purpose wasn't rationality, it was belonging. You followed the rhythm or you risked exile. And in a world without walls, exile meant extinction. So the first laws were not born in palaces or temples. They were born around fires, in the hush between stories, where fear and love shared the same vocabulary. And those who broke them, even by accident, learned quickly that the punishment didn't always come from people. Sometimes the wind went wrong, or the rain stopped visiting, or a child fell sick without reason. The tribe didn't see coincidence. They saw disobedience echoing through the world, like a hairline crack in glass. That's the thing about invisible webs. They're invisible until you tear one. And when you do, you find that it wasn't just holding you, it was holding everyone. The moment one thread snapped, the entire pattern shuddered. And that's when people began to believe that a single mistake could doom not just a person, but an entire clan. Because rules, it turned out, weren't just about behavior. They were about existence, and the dead were still voting. No one ever really invented the rules. They were inherited, like cheekbones or a family curse. Every clan carried them the way they carried their ancestors, unchosen, unquestioned, and, most of the time, unbearably heavy. The logic went something like this. If your great-grandfather didn't eat owl meat because his father died the night he tried, you wouldn't either. You didn't ask why. The why was buried somewhere in the dust of centuries, and digging it up was considered rude. In many places, the rules were not remembered, they were embodied. The Polynesian idea of tapu, the Malagasy feti, the Arctic hunting silences, all these were fragments of an older intelligence, one that didn't separate the spiritual from the practical. A man who broke his tribe's food taboo wasn't just impolite, he'd short-circuited the balance between the living and the invisible world. The ancestors, it was said, didn't sleep. They listened, and the moment someone forgot their part in the chain, misfortune began to gather. Polite at first, like a distant cloud, deciding which direction to rain. You could see this in the smallest acts. Among the Tokopia of the Solomon Islands, one didn't speak the chief's name aloud. Among the Yoruba, certain twins were so charged with spiritual power that entire rituals existed just to keep them content. It wasn't worship, not exactly. It was negotiation. The rules were the terms of a cosmic treaty signed long before anyone alive was born. You followed them not because they were good, but because they were effective. Morality was a later invention. Early rules were all about maintenance, keeping reality stitched together one habit at a time. And when someone questioned them, the world often answered harshly. Colonial anthropologists loved to record such moments. A man in Fiji eating a forbidden fruit, only to die within days, sometimes from guilt, sometimes from bad luck, sometimes from poison placed by the offended. The cause hardly mattered. The rule had spoken, and every time it did, it confirmed itself. The perfect self-perpetuating proof that tradition never dies. It simply waits to be tested. Breaking one rule might anger an ancestor. Breaking several might convince the entire invisible world that your clan had lost its mind. And that's when things truly began to fall apart. Not through lightning or plague, but through small, spreading doubts. If the ancestors couldn't trust you, why would the living, broken rule become a rumor, then a fracture, then a story that would outlive you by centuries? The irony, of course, is that no one remembered who made the rule in the first place. Some whispered that it came from a god, others from a king, others still from a clever grandmother, whose warning became law. But by the time anyone asked, it was too late to change it. The rule had become older than memory, and much harder to survive without. And when one person slipped, it wasn't just their body that bore the cost. It was everyone's, because in the old world, a human wasn't an individual. They were a vessel carrying the past. And soon enough, that idea would become terrifyingly literal. In the ancient imagination, a person wasn't really a person. They were an address, a breathing extension of everyone who came before them, and everyone who'd come after. You didn't belong to a clan. You were the clan, temporarily walking around. So when a hunter broke a taboo, the punishment didn't stop at his bones. It moved sideways into his brothers, his mother, his unborn children. Across the world, you see this eerie arithmetic of guilt. Among the Inuit, if a seal hunter disrespected the animal's spirit, say, by wasting its meat or leaving the skull exposed, it wasn't just his next hunt that failed. It was the entire community's. In Madagascar, violating a feti could bring drought to the fields or sickness to the herds. One person's mistake, everyone's problem. The logic was cosmic communism. Sin and misfortune were shared resources. You can almost admire the efficiency. In a world where survival depended on a few hands and a few tools, it made perfect sense to treat morality as collective property. A single act could tilt the scale of life and death for dozens. The clan was the immune system. One infected cell could kill the body, so the body struck first. That's why punishment wasn't just revenge, it was quarantine. In some Polynesian islands, when someone broke taboo, they weren't executed immediately, they were avoided. Their shadow was dangerous, their breath contagious. The rule breaker became a walking reminder that the world could unravel at any time. Children were told not to look at them. Food was hidden from them. Even the air around them seemed heavier. The clan didn't need prisons. Isolation itself was a sentence. And sometimes, the gods didn't wait for people to act. Anthropologists recorded stories where the guilty never confessed. They simply sickened, or their crops withered, or their family line stopped producing sons. The ancestors, apparently, preferred efficiency to a curse could leap through generations like a rumor that refused to die. Until finally, some descendant, a child born centuries later, paid the bill without even knowing what the debt was for. Modern psychology might call it projection, or guilt, or trauma. But to those early minds, it was far more literal. The boundary between one person and another was thin, almost non-existent. Your body was just one tile in a vast mosaic of flesh, memory, and obligation. When one cracked, the whole picture did. So the old taboos weren't merely about obedience, they were about containment. Every ritual, every prohibition, every impossible rule, don't eat this, don't see that, don't touch her, was a fence keeping chaos from leaking out of someone's soul and into everyone else's. But sometimes, the fence didn't hold. Sometimes guilt spread faster than anyone could stop it, not as a story, but as a sickness. In those early worlds, guilt behaved like weather. It didn't belong to anyone, it drifted. One broken rule could move through a village like a fever no healer could name. A man steals a sacred fruit, and suddenly the fish vanish from the river. A woman speaks her husband's secret name, and babies begin to die in their sleep. No one connects cause and effect through logic. They connect it through pattern. Something invisible was breached, and now the air itself is punishing them. It's almost poetic how seriously they took it. Fraser called it contagious taboo. Mary Douglas called it ritual pollution. But neither term quite captures the dread of living in a world where your neighbor's mistake could make your crops fail. It wasn't superstition, it was ecology. A fragile economy of purity, where a single violation could send the whole system into collapse. Among the Maori, touching a corpse without ritual cleansing could doom not just you, but the canoe you built, the tools you handled, even the food you'd cooked. The impurity spread along every object like a rumor through hands. Among the Dinka, if a taboo was broken and no atonement made, lightning would strike the family cattle until balance was restored. And balance, in that sense, was always physical, never metaphorical. The contagion wasn't confined to touch. Words carried it to an accidental curse, a misused name, or the wrong question could be enough to pollute an entire community's luck. So people spoke with surgical care. Silence, in many places, became the most hygienic form of speech. When something terrible happened, drought, plague, stillbirth, the elders didn't ask what caused it, but who. Someone had crossed a line, knowingly or not, and the world was reacting. The body of the clan flinched before it knew why. It's the same reflex we have when superstition lingers, knocking on wood, crossing fingers, refusing to tempt fate. We've replaced gods with algorithms, but the feeling's the same, that luck is a contagion you can spread by thinking the wrong thought out loud. Back then, the cure was ritual. The pollution had to be drawn out, transferred, burned, buried, or drowned. Maybe an animal would absorb it. Maybe a relative would confess and become the scapegoat. Maybe the entire village would fast or move camp, abandoning the poisoned ground. Whatever it took, the contamination had to leave the collective body. But guilt has a strange appetite. Feed it with sacrifice, and it only learns to hunger more. Soon, the offended spirits weren't satisfied with symbolic gestures. They wanted repayment in full, something alive, something valuable, something that bled. And that's when fear grew teeth and began to eat offerings in the dark. Once a rule was broken, it wasn't enough to apologize. You had to feed the imbalance, literally. The spirits didn't want words, they wanted calories. Meat, grain, blood, sweat, something real enough to taste. To offend them was to owe them, and the debt collection was never symbolic. In parts of Melanesia, if a taboo was violated, the entire village gathered to stage a feast, not of joy, but of appeasement. Pigs were slaughtered in careful numbers, each cut made according to an invisible math of guilt. The smell of smoke rose as an offering to the spirits, who were believed to hover above, sniffing for sincerity. In Africa's old sacrificial rites, a goat's blood might be poured into the soil to cool the earth after an offense, because the ground itself, once offended, was thought to heat with anger. This wasn't cruelty, it was accounting. Every living thing that bled became currency in the great economy of balance. Spirits lent you luck, fertility, or protection, and you repaid them with discipline until someone defaulted. Then the interest accumulated. A broken marriage vow, a dishonest trade, a forgotten ancestor's festival, all debts waiting to be settled. When drought struck, it wasn't the weather misbehaving. It was the unpaid interest of generations. What fascinates anthropologists is how consistent the logic was across continents. The Trabriand islanders, the Dogon, the ancient Israelites, all believed that misfortune wasn't random but negotiated. Sacrifice wasn't violence, it was diplomacy. To slit a goat's throat wasn't cruelty, it was civic duty. Someone had to re-establish the contract between heaven and earth before the spirits started repossessing things like harvests, children, or sanity. And these spirits weren't monsters. They were bureaucrats with cosmic job descriptions. They didn't act out of malice, only principle. Break a rule, and they'd simply adjust the books. Floods, disease, madness, those were just late fees. The terrifying part was that no one ever really knew which spirit had been offended. You could sacrifice for years, and the rain still wouldn't come. That's how rituals became elaborate. The more ambiguous the guilt, the more spectacular the repayment. People built altars, buried amulets, burned their best food, even mutilated themselves. Anything to prove sincerity. And over time, as the feasts and sacrifices piled up, something unexpected happened. Fear turned inward. The invisible creditors weren't hovering in the sky anymore. They'd moved into the mind. Eventually, the spirits stopped needing altars. They learned to live rent-free inside people's heads. Fear had become internalized, a self-sustaining surveillance system running on shame. You no longer needed to be struck by lightning to feel punished. Your own thoughts did the job beautifully. When missionaries arrived in places like West Africa or Polynesia, they were often amazed at how effortlessly the locals converted to Christianity, as if they'd been rehearsing it for centuries. But of course they had. The idea of invisible overseers who monitored behavior and dispensed blessings or curses was nothing new. The only difference was the uniform. The old ancestors were replaced by saints, angels, and an omniscient deity who kept better records. Even after the gods were renamed, the clan's gaze never vanished. It just moved behind the eyes. A Malagasy farmer might break a feti and still feel watched decades after moving to the city. An Inuit hunter who once violated a seal ritual might find his grandchildren uneasy around knives, for reasons no one can articulate. These are residues of belief. molecular traces of a world that trained humans to fear moral contagion the way they now fear viruses. Anthropologists noticed how gossip often took the place of divine punishment. When the spirits grew silent, the neighbors spoke louder. The threat of supernatural reprisal became the threat of humiliation, and shame filled the ecological niche once occupied by curses. The social body had evolved new antibodies. You didn't need thunder to strike the disobedient. A whisper was enough. And it's strange, this internal vigilance didn't die with modernity. It simply updated its software. The clan became a conscience. The curse became anxiety. The idea that someone will find out lingers, even when there's no one left to care. Every culture invented its own methods of invisible watching. Confession, therapy, surveillance cameras, different rituals, same biology. The human brain refuses to live unwatched. It's as if, over time, people realized the ancestors didn't need to hover above when they could haunt from within. The mind itself became sacred ground, full of unspoken shrines and invisible judges. You could leave your village, abandon your gods, move to a city of strangers, and still hear that small ancestral voice asking, was that allowed? And when that voice grew too loud, societies found a way to project it outward again, to assign guilt to one person, one body, so the rest could breathe. When the air grew too thick with guilt, someone had to breathe it for everyone else. That's where the scapegoat came in, a human lightning rod for the clan's invisible storms. One body to absorb the contagion and carry it away, preferably somewhere out of sight. It was a solution so elegant that nearly every civilization invented it independently. The ancient Hebrews sent a literal goat into the wilderness, smeared with the sins of the people. The Greeks exiled their pharmakos, a wretched man paraded through the streets, Beaten, mocked, and finally expelled to purify the city. In Africa and Melanesia, entire villages appointed sin carriers, men who'd ritually absorb misfortune through touch or food before vanishing into the bush. You could say it was efficient, if a little cruel. Why punish everyone when one person could take the fall? But it also revealed something deeper about how humans understood guilt, that it's not meant to vanish, only to migrate. The sin didn't disappear, it just changed address. A neat cosmic transaction, suffering as sanitation. What made it truly unsettling was how this logic seeped into myth. The stories people told weren't about justice, but displacement. Oedipus, cursed by his father's crime, kills his own father and blinds himself, not to undo the curse, but to embody it. Cain, marked forever for killing his brother, becomes the eternal wanderer whose punishment keeps the rest of humanity pure. The Dogon told of twin brothers, one sacred and one cursed, the latter doomed to walk forever carrying the clan's misdeeds in his bones. Anthropologists saw patterns that mirrored ritual. Myth gave moral structure to what ritual achieved physically, the export of guilt. And it worked because people desperately needed to believe that their suffering was transferable, that there was a way to bundle chaos, label it, and send it off like unwanted mail. The irony, of course, is that these scapegoats often became sacred after the fact. Once expelled, they turned into saints, martyrs, or cultural heroes. The cursed body was rebranded as divine insurance, dangerous to keep, catastrophic to destroy. It's hard not to notice how modern societies still run on this same nervous system. Every era has its purges, its outcasts, its public sacrifices of reputation. We call it accountability now, but the ritual choreography hasn't changed much. When one person absorbs the pain of many, everyone else feels lighter, at least for a while, until the next mistake, the next tremor in the web. Because what the scapegoat really removed wasn't guilt, but memory. And societies, like people, can't function without remembering what not to do. So they began to encode the lessons, not in blood anymore, but in rules. Every prohibition was a fossilized story of a time the world almost broke. Every prohibition was once a panic, solidified. You can trace the outline of ancient disasters in the shape of the rules that survived them. Don't eat that fish probably meant someone did, and the village buried half its population by dawn. Don't marry your cousin might have begun as an observation that too many babies were born wrong. Rules were fossils of fear, stories turned into instructions. Among the Dogon taboos on weaving certain days of the week were said to keep cosmic balance. But early ethnographies suspected a more local truth. Too many looms clattering at once might anger neighbors or overstretched resources. Among the Polynesians, prohibitions against crossing certain reefs weren't random superstition. They preserved fish stocks that might have vanished under greed. In that sense, taboos were memory disguised as reverence, ways of transmitting history without words. Each rule carried a ghost. Don't go into that forest. A massacre happened there. Don't whistle after dark. Someone once did and never came back. You didn't need archives when you had fear. It remembered perfectly. Over generations, these warnings detached from their original tragedies and became sacred law. The ancestors didn't want obedience for its own sake. They wanted continuity. But over time, continuity hardened into paranoia, and the living forgot what they were protecting, only that it must not be touched. In Madagascar, breaking a feti could still trigger panic centuries after its cause was forgotten. When anthropologist Maurice Bloch asked villagers why a particular bird was forbidden, they shrugged. It's just not done. That phrase, so simple, so absolute, is the sound of memory fossilized. Civilization's foundation stones are made of precisely that, the quiet weight of not done. And there's something tragically human about it. We inherit danger second-hand, stripped of context, but heavy with consequence. Like children afraid of the dark long after the wolves are gone, rules become a kind of collective amnesia, a way of forgetting safely. They preserve the trauma, but erase its origin, so no one has to relive it, only obey it. Still, that memory could never stay buried. As societies changed, as gods fell silent and the old spirits retreated, the fear of breaking rules had to find new bodies, because the human need for order and for punishment doesn't vanish. It just gets rebranded. And so the ghosts of taboo slipped quietly into our modern rituals, disguised as something we call progress. We like to think we've outgrown it, the fear that one wrong act could doom the group. But scratch the surface of any civilization, and the old reflex twitches. The invisible web still hums. It just learned Wi-Fi. Breaking a rule no longer summons drought or disease, only public outrage, which can feel worse. A misstep spreads through digital air faster than any ancestral curse, and exile comes with pixel precision. The village bonfire has become a comment section, and the scapegoat doesn't need to walk into the wilderness anymore. The wilderness comes to them. Anthropologists would call it continuity. The method of purification changed, the structure didn't. Online shame rituals follow almost the same choreography as old purification rites: collective identification of impurity, public condemnation, symbolic expulsion, and most importantly, the restoration of group virtue. Everyone feels clean again once the sinner is gone. It's social hygiene, just with better lighting and worse empathy. Even beyond the internet, the ancient dread of contagion lingers in subtler forms. Corporations rush to disown a single employee for a bad tweet. Families hide a relative's addiction like a cursed talisman. Nations rewrite history to conceal the bones under their foundations. We still behave as if guilt is contagious and silence is the only vaccine. The irony is exquisite. The more secular we become, the more religious our enforcement feels. Public morality now operates with the zeal of the old priesthood: penance, confession, absolution, and the eternal promise that next time will be pure. The gods may be gone, but the algorithms are always watching, measuring worth through engagement metrics instead of incense. It's tempting to laugh at the comparison, but every generation rebuilds the same machinery: rules that protect, punish, and perform memory. And beneath all the noise, there's still that ancient superstition whispering through our nervous systems that breaking the invisible order doesn't just harm you, it threatens us all. We haven't outgrown taboo, we've digitized it. The world runs on invisible agreements and collective fear, and no one's sure who wrote the terms. Every click, every word, every silence is an offering to something that can't be seen, but can absolutely retaliate. And perhaps that's the truest sign we're still human, the knowledge that chaos is always one mistake away. But there's one more secret those early clans understood, something modern societies are still pretending to forget. The rules were never about control, they were about survival, about keeping the world from dissolving back into the dark. For all their cruelty and absurdity, the old rules were never meant to cage people, they were meant to hold the world together with thread and breath. Every don't was a way of whispering to the void, stay still. The first lawgiver wasn't a king or a god, but fear itself, a perfectly reasonable response to a universe that didn't care whether you survived the night. You can see it in the earliest settlements, a ring of huts, a circle of firelight, and beyond that, the abyss. The people who sat there didn't think of morality, they thought of maintenance. Keep the dead quiet, keep the rain coming, keep the crops listening. Order had to be performed daily, like feeding a hungry animal. That's why the smallest transgressions, touching the wrong corpse, crossing the wrong threshold, cooking on the wrong day, could unravel everything. The universe was a temperamental guest, and the rules were the polite small talk that kept it from leaving. Even now, after gods have retired and reason has taken over the bureaucracy, that instinct lingers. Modern life is full of invisible rites designed to prevent collapse. Seatbelt laws, recycling bins, morning affirmations, all soft prayers disguised as logic. Every time someone says be careful, they're reciting an ancient spell against entropy. Anthropologists often end their field notes with cautious admiration. The people they studied, the ones mocked for their fear of taboo, somehow managed to survive for millennia on nothing but stories and restraint. They built societies not from courage, but from caution. Every rule that kept them small also kept them alive. And perhaps that's the quiet lesson buried beneath all this. Civilization isn't the triumph of freedom over fear, it's the choreography of both. Fear gave structure to courage. Rules gave rhythm to chaos. The clan that punished one member for breaking a rule wasn't barbaric. It was terrified of vanishing, of slipping back into the noise before meaning existed. So, yes, breaking a rule could doom a whole clan, not because spirits were cruel, but because the web was real. Pull one thread, and you could feel the tremor in the sky. And maybe, if you listen closely enough, that web still hums, stretched thin between history and memory, between reason and the dark. Because every civilization, in the end, is just a fragile agreement not to let the world fall apart again. Long before commandments were carved into stone, or kings decided which sins were worth dying for, there were rules written in breath. They drifted between people like smoke, invisible and binding. Every glance, every silence, every step had a hidden clause. A man could walk through the same patch of grass his whole life and never realize there was a line he mustn't cross, until one day he did, and the air shifted. That's how laws began, not as declarations, but as reactions. The first legislation was felt, not spoken. Those early humans weren't naive. They were exquisitely paranoid, and for good reason. The world was unreliable. Animals bit, storms misbehaved, and the dark had opinions. So people learned choreography before philosophy. Don't touch what glows. Don't name what hunts. Don't eat what stares back. It wasn't morality yet. It was survival disguised as etiquette. If something worked, if it kept the tribe breathing and the fires burning, it became sacred by repetition. What we now call belief began as pattern recognition dressed up for dinner. There's something strangely elegant about it. The air before law, humming with rules no one remembered inventing. It wasn't authority that enforced them. It was atmosphere. A child didn't need to be told not to whistle after dark. They could feel the weight of the night pressing against their teeth. To live among those invisible boundaries was to exist inside a collective nervous system. Each person a synapse in a trembling organism called the clan. The wrong gesture wasn't just rude, it was dangerous. You could unmake the balance of things with a careless act. In that sense, the first legislators weren't kings, priests, or even ancestors. They were accidents. Someone once stepped on the wrong kind of root. The earth shook, and a new rule was born. The story spread faster than explanation could catch it, and suddenly, the entire valley agreed. Never touch that root again. No debate, no dissent, just the quiet terror of coincidence mistaken for cause, which in a world without science, was the only kind of reasoning available. Fear did the rest. Fear, in those days, wasn't cowardice, it was organization. It arranged life into predictable shapes. Days for hunting, days for silence, days when even laughter could offend the sky. If the rains came on schedule, you didn't question the rules, you added a few more for good measure. The point wasn't to understand, it was to maintain. People didn't bow to power because they were meek. They bowed because the universe was twitchy and easily spooked. Every ritual was a negotiation to keep it calm. And if that sounds absurd, think of it this way. When nothing separates life from death but luck, it's perfectly rational to treat luck like a contract. Those early taboos were clauses in an unspoken treaty between humans and everything that might kill them. You didn't need literacy to understand leverage. One broken rule, and the wind might go strange. Two, and the sea might swallow your cousin. The punishment was rarely immediate, but it always came, somewhere, somehow, to someone related to you by blood or proximity. It wasn't superstition. It was probability with personality. That's the trouble with invisible order. It doesn't forgive mistakes, it just redistributes them. And fear, once it finds a rhythm, starts to hum in your bones like memory. Over time, it begins to look suspiciously like morality, the kind built not from love or justice, but from long experience with disaster. Fear was the only lawmaker that didn't need a throne. It didn't even need to raise its voice. A rustle in the reeds, a cough from a cave, a strange silence after a meal. These were enough to remind people that the world was always watching, even when it looked empty. Before the idea of sin, there was simply risk. And every rule that stuck began as an attempt to manage it. Fear worked because it was consistent. It wasn't sentimental, and it didn't negotiate. It taught through survival rates, not sermons. It didn't need to argue the philosophy of not drinking from a stagnant pond. The corpses nearby handled the persuasion. Fear had perfect statistics long before anyone invented counting, and that's what made it such an efficient teacher. It rewarded obedience with life. Across prehistory, entire moral systems were really just fear management programs. Don't eat that fish, don't touch that corpse, don't mention that name. Half of these rules preserved hygiene, the other half preserved sanity. Together, they created a psychological firewall between humans and chaos. The same impulse that makes someone today check if they locked the door again, just in case, once made people burn offerings to the rain. Fear, in that sense, wasn't irrational. It was the most practical emotion on Earth. What's ironic is how fear became dignified over time. Once it was instinct, an unspoken twitch in the stomach. Then came the specialists, priests, prophets, lawgivers, people who learned to read the tremors of terror and translate them into policy. They didn't abolish fear. They domesticated it. They gave it costumes, prayers, and architectural floor plans. The first temples were really just containment facilities for anxiety. You could bring your dread, lay it on an altar, and leave feeling safer, which is to say, more obedient. You can still see the logic in early ritual design. Every repetitive motion, bowing, circling, chanting, was a way of turning panic into pattern. The human brain loves pattern. It calms the noise, and so fear slowly became architecture. It built walls, cities, calendars. It became an institution that could outlive its founders. By the time the first civilizations rose, the raw terror of storms and predators had been sublimated into something far more sustainable, the dread of breaking rules. And that dread, oddly enough, kept people organized. Fear didn't divide them, it synchronized them. Everyone knew where the invisible lines were, even if no one remembered why. They followed them like migrating birds, guided not by reason, but by a shared sense of unease. You can mock it now, of course, call it superstition, paranoia, social control. But those who lived by it managed to outlast volcanoes, plagues, and cosmic indifference. For all its cruelty, fear was stunningly good at its job. It's almost poetic. Civilizations were built not on courage, but on caution. The heroes came later, after the fences were up. Before that, humanity survived by flinching at the right time. And that's what made fear the perfect legislator. It was democratic, immediate, and impossible to ignore. From that shared fear came something stranger, a new sense of collective identity. Because when one person trembled, everyone did. And that's how the clan began to think of itself not as individuals, but as one body with many nerves. The clan was less a collection of people than a single organism with shared skin. Every person was a moving cell inside it, responsible not just for their own survival, but for the balance of the whole. Individuality, that fragile luxury we worship now, didn't exist yet. What mattered was containment, keeping the body of the clan unbroken, the bloodline untainted, the world unoffended. You can see traces of this thinking in almost every early society anthropologists ever studied. Among Arctic hunters, a single mistake during a seal ritual could curse not one man but the entire settlement. The next hunts would fail. Children would sicken. Storms would misbehave. The offender didn't just carry guilt, he radiated it. And the clan, acting like a body with a wound, had to isolate or expel him before the infection spread. They weren't cruel, they were performing immune response. Guilt, back then, wasn't emotional, it was atmospheric. It lingered in huts, in food, in tools. If a taboo was broken, people cleaned everything that had touched the transgressor. Bowls, clothing, even footprints. Words were scrubbed too. The clan had to restore purity, not metaphorically but materially. You could say it was religion, but it was closer to hygiene. Every community invented its own way of washing fear off reality. The idea that one person's act could doom everyone else wasn't superstition, it was pattern recognition. In small groups, survival depended on near-perfect cooperation. A single wrong move, spoiling food, angering spirits, ignoring omens, could collapse the whole ecosystem. So rules evolved like antibodies. Fast, adaptive, brutally efficient. Don't touch the dead seal until the shaman speaks. Don't eat before the elders taste. Don't sleep in the same hut as the sick. Over time, these protocols hardened into taboos, and once a rule saved lives, it became sacred. That's how biology became theology. Nature rewarded obedience, and people mistook survival for divine approval. If fear made the laws, the clan enforced them with love. The possessive, suffocating kind that doesn't allow mistakes. It's an uncomfortable thought, but early communities weren't just families, they were surveillance systems. Everyone watched everyone else, not because they were nosy, but because the body needed constant monitoring. A bad hunter endangered the group. A lazy gatherer could drain the stores. Even a careless word could attract cosmic punishment. So gossip, in many ways, was humanity's first immune reflex, the social fever that warns when something's wrong. That shared vigilance created a strange intimacy. Every breath was communal, every silence a public act. Children grew up already entangled in the web of obligations, not as future individuals, but as future organs of the same body. You didn't own your name, your choices, or even your shadow. They all belonged to the clan. And when someone broke a rule, it wasn't their mistake. It was a disease in the bloodstream. This is why punishment, when it came, wasn't just justice, it was medicine. To exile a sinner was to cauterize a wound. To kill them was surgery. The goal wasn't vengeance, it was balance. Because in a world that saw the community as one living creature, mercy could look like rot. And yet, no matter how carefully the clan cleaned itself, the infection always found new ways in. Because guilt had an inconvenient habit of behaving like weather, drifting, settling, seeping through cracks in ritual and reason alike. Guilt, in those early worlds, moved like mist. It didn't belong to anyone. It settled wherever it pleased. A broken rule could drift through a village the way a sickness does, invisible, intimate, impossible to cure. One man eats the wrong fruit, and suddenly the river dries. A woman utters a forbidden name, and infants start dying in their sleep. The logic wasn't linear, it was ecological. Misfortune spread through connection, not causation. You didn't ask what caused it, you asked who. Anthropologists would later call this ritual pollution, but to the people inside it, it was simpler. Dirt that wasn't dirt. The body, the mind, and the spirit all shared plumbing, and when one leaked, the others flooded. That's why purity rituals were less about faith than about plumbing maintenance. A contaminated person could poison not just themselves, but everything they touched. Food, tools, breath. So they washed, burned, buried, abstained. Hygiene was survival theology. Take the Embori of Aotearoa. Touch a corpse without ritual cleansing, and your entire household became Noah, unclean. Even your canoe could become cursed. It wouldn't float right, as if wood itself could feel disgust. Or the Dinka of Sudan. If someone violated a food taboo and failed to confess, lightning might strike their cattle until balance was restored. Nature didn't punish out of anger, it simply recalibrated. The cosmos, in its own bureaucratic way, demanded closure. What's fascinating is how physical it all was. Pollution didn't just stick to hands, it stuck to words. Speaking wrongly could be as dangerous as touching wrongly. Among many Arctic peoples, the dead had to be addressed by new names after burial, because calling them by their old ones might lure them back. Among others, naming a powerful animal aloud could drain your luck. So silence became the most hygienic form of speech, a disinfectant for the mouth. Rituals of purification weren't optional, They were maintenance schedules for existence. Smoke, salt, blood, and fire, the universal cleaning products of prehistory. Some burnt herbs to sterilize the air. Others fasted to purge invisible residue from their guts. The specifics varied, but the principle was constant. Pollution must move. It had to be carried off, absorbed, or neutralized. Nothing could stay unbalanced for long, because balance was life itself. And when nothing else worked, the clan turned to substitution, the strange art of trading one impurity for another. If the world was sick, it needed a host, something to absorb the guilt and carry it away. That logic would grow teeth in the centuries to come, evolving into sacrifice, scapegoats, and the endless negotiation between fear and blood. At some point, fear learned to count. The invisible dread that once just hovered in the air started keeping ledgers. Break a rule, owe a debt. Simple. The universe became an accountant, and everything alive was on credit. You didn't just offend the spirits, you created a deficit in the balance sheet of existence, and sooner or later it had to be paid. The logic was disarmingly practical. Misfortune wasn't random, it was interest accruing. The rain didn't fail because the gods were cruel, but because someone hadn't made their payments. Every drought, every plague, every inconvenient death was an overdue notice. The cosmos ran on reciprocity, offerings in, blessings out. Miss a payment, and the creditors came knocking, sometimes literally, in the form of a fever or a failed harvest. This is how sacrifice emerged, not from bloodlust, but from bookkeeping. You could see it in Melanesia, where an offended spirit might demand a pig, not for pleasure but for proof of remorse. The animal's life became a receipt. In parts of Africa, a goat's blood was poured into the soil to cool it after an offense. The logic was consistent. Heat meant imbalance, guilt, anger in the earth itself. The cure was cooling repayment through life. Nothing was symbolic. The spirits didn't take metaphorical currency. They wanted calories, meat, sweat, song, something real enough to taste. And if one offering didn't work, you tried another. Bigger animal, better feast, longer dance. Every culture developed its own version of cosmic negotiation, because existence was essentially a transaction. Safety rented, never owned. You can almost admire the efficiency. Fear had evolved into a moral economy, a closed system where guilt circulated like money and sacrifice functioned as tax. The beauty of it was that no one questioned the exchange rate. If the rain came after a ceremony, payment confirmed. If it didn't, well, perhaps the gods wanted premium offerings next time. The debt always explained itself. But debt, once invented, never stops growing. What began as a way to calm the elements eventually became a way to manage each other. Spirits weren't the only creditors anymore. Chiefs, priests, and elders realized they could collect in advance, demand obedience to prevent offense, gather offerings before the storm even threatened. Fear, now monetized, became infrastructure. The sacred merged with the administrative, and, the more ambiguous the guilt, the larger the repayment had to be. A broken taboo might once have cost a goat. By the time kingdoms rose, it could cost a human. The logic didn't change, only the scale. Each civilization merely raised the price of its own survival. And yet, beneath all the spectacle, the smoke, the blood, the trembling crowds, something subtle was happening. The offerings no longer just fed spirits. They began feeding the mind itself, which was learning to keep its own accounts. The gods had trained people so well that soon they wouldn't need to send thunder anymore. The thunder would live inside them. At first, the gods shouted. Then they whispered. Eventually, they moved in. Somewhere between the altar and the skull, the sacred relocated, and humanity discovered the exquisite convenience of self-surveillance. You no longer needed lightning to strike you dead. Shame did the job just fine. It's astonishing, really, how fast fear adapted once architecture appeared. The old gods who had lived in trees and storms were now comfortably housed in temples, then in stories, then in the quiet, windowless chambers of the mind. What began as external punishment evolved into internal software. People started policing themselves before anyone else had to. A clean conscience was simply a well-trained spirit. Missionaries who wandered into Polynesia or West Africa centuries later were often puzzled by how easily the locals converted to Christianity, as if it were an upgrade they'd already anticipated. But of course they had. The infrastructure was in place. Invisible overseers. Check. Daily rituals of purification. Check. The idea that thoughts themselves could contaminate. old news. The only thing that changed was the branding. The ancestors gave way to angels, the spirits to saints, the village cursed to eternal damnation. Even when the names changed, the habits remained. A Malagasy farmer breaking a feti, a local taboo, might still feel watched decades after moving to the city. An Inuit hunter who once disrespected a seal might find his grandchildren uneasy around knives, not knowing why. The gods were no longer above. They'd gone cellular, hereditary. Belief became epigenetic. This internalization had a side effect. It made guilt portable. Once, a mistake ended where the village ended. Now, it followed you across oceans and lifetimes. You could exile a sinner, but you couldn't exile his conscience. The rule breaker carried his own witness. Every thought became a courtroom, every silence a jury. And if the spirits were quieter now, society filled the gap. Gossip took over divine punishment's old job. The whisper replaced the thunderclap. A careless act no longer summoned drought or plague, just humiliation, which could feel worse. Shame became the new contagion, and the clan, reborn as community, evolved subtler methods of purification. Ostracism replaced sacrifice, rumor replaced ritual. Fear remained, just better organized. By the time civilization congratulated itself for outgrowing superstition, it was already trapped in its most sophisticated form. The gods had retired, yes, but their management system was still running, invisible, efficient, fully automated. It watched through neighbors, through reputations, through that persistent voice at the back of your mind that murmurs, "Was that allowed?" And when that voice grew unbearable, humanity invented its most brilliant coping mechanism yet, to take that guilt and give it a body again, so everyone else could breathe easier. When the air grew too thick with guilt, someone had to breathe it for everyone else. That's where the scapegoat came in, humanity's most elegant moral technology. A single body, chosen or condemned, to absorb the static of collective unease. Once burdened, it had to vanish. Not die necessarily, though death was popular, but disappear from sight. Out of the village, out of memory, out of the contagion loop. You can find the pattern almost anywhere. The ancient Hebrews sent a literal goat into the wilderness, smeared with the sins of the people. The Greeks paraded their pharmakos, a ragged man dragged through the streets, beaten, spat on, and expelled to purify the city. In parts of Africa and Melanesia, entire villages appointed sincariers, men who'd ritually eat or touch something unclean before being sent away to die in the bush. Civilization, it turned out, was excellent at exporting guilt. The logic was consistent. Impurity had to move. It couldn't be erased, only transferred. One life ruined, so the rest could reset their moral clocks. A perfect system, brutally efficient, psychologically soothing, and spiritually satisfying. After all, what's one body against the health of the collective? What's haunting is how myth turned this into theater. Oedipus blinds himself not to escape the curse, but to contain it. Cain becomes the eternal wanderer, carrying the mark so no one else has to. In Dogon stories, one twin is born sacred and the other cursed, doomed to wander the earth with the tribe's moral residue in his bones. The narrative remained the same, suffering as sanitation, and somehow, the outcast always ended up holy. Once expelled, they became sacred, martyrs to the machinery of purification. Saints, prophets, heroes, all former scapegoats, rebranded. It's a pattern so durable it still runs in the background of modern life. Every public scandal, every online mob, every fallen celebrity performs the same ancient choreography. We identify the impurity, project the fear, purge the host, and bask in temporary then we wait for the next infection. The scapegoat never fixed the system, it only cleared the symptoms. But it allowed societies to keep functioning without imploding from collective guilt. Every expulsion bought time, every sacrifice delayed introspection, and each time, the moral weight that had once pressed against the heavens shifted a little further inward, where it fossilized as memory. Because sooner or later, the story stopped being about them, the cursed, the outcast, the monster. They became about why it kept happening, and that's how the rules began to multiply, carved not to prevent guilt, but to prevent its need to travel. Every rule was once a bruise. You can still feel the tenderness if you press the right way. Behind every don't lies a story of the time someone did, and everything went horribly wrong. Don't eat that fish probably meant the village buried half its people in one night. "Don't sleep in that cave" might have started with a collapse that swallowed a generation. What we call taboo began as post-traumatic documentation, disaster notes written in superstition because paper hadn't been invented yet. Anthropologists, in their careful neutrality, called these memory fossils. The Dogon forbade weaving on certain days to keep cosmic balance, but it was likely a more local concern. Maybe the looms made too much noise when others needed silence to hunt. In Madagascar, eating certain birds was still forbidden centuries after anyone remembered why. When Maurice Bloch asked villagers the reason, they shrugged. It's just not done. That phrase, that sigh of quiet obedience, is the sound of catastrophe fossilized into culture. Taboos weren't nonsense. They were field notes from survival's rough draft. The world used to punish curiosity directly, so humans built barriers around it. Each generation inherited the debris of ancestral terror, a museum of behavioral landmines. Over time, the reasons eroded, but the fear endured, because forgetting the context made the rule even stronger. If you don't know what you're protecting yourself from, you'll never dare to test it. It's strange to realize how much of civilization is built on inherited fright. The Polynesian tapu, the Hindu ashuda, the Hebrew tame, all echoes of events no one wanted to repeat. Rules outlasted their tragedies because they turned panic into structure. That's why ancient societies seemed so ritual-obsessed. They weren't worshipping gods, they were rehearsing memory. Every gesture said, "We remember the thing that almost killed us, and we won't let it happen again." Even now, we follow their rhythm without knowing it. Don't mix this, don't touch that, don't say those words. Modern equivalents of keeping the ghosts asleep. Etiquette, law, custom, all layers of ancestral sediment compacted by fear and polished by repetition. You can almost see the lineage. Superstition becomes taboo, taboo becomes law, law becomes habit, habit becomes morality, and morality, for all its enlightenment, still smells faintly of smoke and blood. The tragic irony is that the rules survive better than the stories. The warnings remained, but their reasons decomposed. So we keep obeying long after the danger's gone, like children afraid of the dark centuries after the wolves disappeared. Civilization is full of these ghosts, harmless now, but still whispering. And when people finally began to forget even that whisper, the world found a way to remind them that the fear was never gone, only dormant. It simply needed a new shape, a new altar, and a brighter torch. It's tempting to think the old fears died when the firelight faded, that we buried them under reason and Wi-Fi. But if you squint at the way we behave online, you can see the same old reflex twitching. The bonfire became a screen, the clan became a comment section, and the expulsion rituals now come with hashtags. A person breaks an invisible rule, posts the wrong sentence, wears the wrong thing, misjudges the tone, and the village erupts. The air thickens, the punishment arrives, and once again, everyone feels clean. What's eerie is how perfectly this mirrors the choreography of purification. First comes the detection, the collective gasp that identifies impurity. Then the denunciation, a modern form of naming the unclean aloud. After that, the isolation, deletion, unfollowing, digital avoidance, and finally, the restoration, the warm afterglow of shared virtue. Nobody calls it religion, but the rhythm's identical. The difference is that now, the gods are algorithms, and they never sleep. Even outside the internet, you can sense the same current. Corporations sacrifice employees to appease public anger. Governments offer apologies like burnt offerings. Families still hide their addicts, their bankruptcies, their disowned sons. Nobody wants to be the house where misfortune starts. It's ancient social hygiene with a PR department. We've swapped masks of bark and ash for press releases and silence. It's almost poetic. The more secular we become, the more sacred our outrage feels. The priesthood just changed uniforms. Moderators, journalists, influencers. Confession takes place in interviews now. Repentance comes as a Notes app screenshot. The exorcisms are bloodless, but not painless. The exile is digital, but it still burns. What's changed isn't the fear of contamination, it's the speed of it. In the past, a rumor could poison a village. Now it can poison a planet before breakfast. We call it virality, as if the metaphor wasn't already ancient. The contagion that once moved through bone and shadow now travels through pixels, but it obeys the same biology. Fear spreads faster than thought. punishment spreads faster than guilt. The irony is that, for all our technological sophistication, we're still performing the same dance that kept the first clans alive. We keep balance through shared panic, maintain purity through collective punishment, and convince ourselves that expulsion equals safety. The ghosts of Taboo didn't vanish, they just learned to use broadband. And yet, hidden beneath all this noise, there's something strangely familiar. The old impulse wasn't born from cruelty. It was born from the will to keep the world intact. Every culture that survived learned one thing: chaos always waits just beyond the firelight. Which is why, even now, with all our confidence and code, we still whisper to the dark the same plea our ancestors once did: stay still. For all their superstition and cruelty, the ancients got one thing right: the world is fragile. It doesn't take much to knock it off balance. One careless gesture, one broken rhythm, one person forgetting what kept the night quiet. That was the real reason for taboos. They weren't prisons, they were glue. Every don't was a tiny knot holding the fabric together. Fear wasn't an obstacle to civilization, it was the loom that wove it. Picture it: a ring of huts, a ring of fire, a ring of rules. Beyond that circle, nothing but teeth and noise. Inside it, order had to be rehearsed daily. Keep the dead quiet, keep the sky satisfied, keep the earth cool. There was no morality in it, only maintenance. The universe, at that stage, was a temperamental guest. You couldn't own it. You could only host it politely and hope it stayed. That's the part modern minds forget. Those taboos, the strange, repetitive, sometimes absurd rituals, were acts of care disguised as fear. They were ways of feeding reality so it wouldn't starve and turn against you. Every offering, every prohibition, every whispered rule was a soft negotiation with chaos, and for a very long time, it worked. Entire civilizations lasted on the delicate faith that obedience could keep existence from unraveling. When the gods went silent, the etiquette remained. We built new versions of those boundaries: laws, manners, ethics, science, all ways to keep the world still. We like to call it progress, but it's the same choreography, just with cleaner hands. Recycling bins instead of sacrifices, seatbelts instead of prayer, therapy instead of confession. The form changed, the anxiety didn't. Anthropologists often end their field notes with a kind of reluctant admiration. They realized those people, the ones mocked for fearing invisible dangers, survived longer than most empires that came after. They understood something we keep trying to forget: that civilization isn't the absence of fear, but the arrangement of it. Order is just panic performed gracefully. So yes, taboos were the real laws of survival. They didn't teach people how to live, they taught them how not to vanish. Every silence, every superstition, every trembling rule was a line drawn against the dark. And maybe, if you listen closely, that line's still humming, stretched thin between memory and reason, between the living and the forgotten. Because the truth is, we've never outgrown those invisible webs. We've only learned to call them something else.